Belal, can we start maybe briefly with you, and can you give us a very brief look back into the very recent history of COVID, of course, how a bit of the cooperation came together, and about vaccinations and quarantine, and how somehow cooperation actually did work practically, because most of the people in the room were not there in these daily and weekly cooperation meetings. What happened actually?
Well, I think as human beings, crisis always brings us together. And we all believe that what happened during the COVID, a crisis that shipping has never faced before. And none of us, our social partners alone, we employers alone, could actually solve the puzzle that the seafarers were suffering. It was not just a crew change, but it was no shore leave. It was unable to go to the doctor. Even someone with an emergency also was not allowed to go ashore. All these things together could not, we realize, be solved by each of us alone. And obviously, ship owners form a bigger part of the decisions that we make. What really happened was that ITF, IMEC initially came together, and then obviously ICS came on board, because everybody, we are all working separately. So we said we need to work together. And I have to say that apart from the great work done by our team, 24 hours, odd times, meetings on Zoom, but one of the key cohesion in those days was a relationship that I have developed with Stephen and Guy, who is unfortunately could not be here today, that we decided that not only that our teams interact, but we also should have a conversation with honesty. Because when you have a group of people meeting, we always have this not sure what the others are saying, but as leaders of 3 organizations, we were 100% honest on what we wanted to achieve. And it's all one goal, to assist the seafarers. So that crisis brought not just the leaders of the 3 organizations, but whole group together. And for me, based in Singapore means most of the meetings were late evening, midnight. Even I remember one meeting was 2 o'clock in the morning. But we all worked hard. We were very sincere. And that is the basis of a further cooperation, again, that we are here today to say that was the reason we said, if we can work together on a crisis like this, surely we can work on many issues that we used to work separately. Yeah. Where we can work together, we will work together. And that has resulted in something probably we'll talk a little bit later. Yeah. So this is the background of why 3 of us are sitting here today.
Right, Steve, maybe you can give us, you came to the top of the ITF when you said we have an assertive militant approach in the ITF and we will fight from the front, being frank. How can you all of a sudden, with the first day of the pandemic, turn around and say, okay, now we're actually not fighting the other side of the table anymore?
Thanks, Max, and thanks for doing your homework. You remember, in a modern age, what you say and everyone remembers what you said. I actually don't think there's any difference, because ultimately we're all from different parts of the same industry, and the expectations of unions and seafarers, which is fantastic to have them on the panel today, could be quite different from the reality of a ship owner. So we talk to our audiences. So the first part of building a different kind of collaboration are what are the terms of engagement. So we can come to a manning conference and you can smell the competitive instinct in the room. So for us as individuals, it was right, let's leave the weapons at the door and let's start having a conversation about what are the practical problems. And if we're brutally honest, the whole of the industry was neglected by policymakers, governments, And I think the most powerful part was building personal relationships, but we only hold our positions because of our organisations, convincing our organisations to follow in the same direction. No point me agreeing that we're going to be very grown up about getting seafarers off ships and 150 ITF inspectors dragging them off ships. So we had to have a continuity of decision making, but we had to start with that clarity about, well, first it's like, shit, what is happening here? And I think if we all go through those phases, we thought, this is going to be 3 months. And it was 6 months. And before we knew it, we had 18 seafarers on board for 18 months. And routes where you couldn't get off Australia to China, couldn't get off a ship. And all of those ancillary problems we were discussing. How do we communicate to the inspectorate? Even if you wanted to move crew, there weren't planes. Another part of ITF's problem, but there were no civil aviation professionals. So for us, it was like, what are we trying to achieve? First, we want a cohesive message to policymakers and governments, and that began to formulate. And then, because ITF works in all of the transport modes, we have to sort of reflect on the unique nature of shipping.
Yeah.
And we have to recognise that somehow we sit as an invisible industry. Mm-hmm. And when we are collaborating as employers, unions, then we're in a position to convince regulators and governments. And we spoke to so many governments who ultimately the transport ministries didn't have the authority to overrule the health ministry. Mm-hmm. So it's lockdown, lockdown, lockdown. So we had to go all the way up to the UN Secretary General, which came out on behalf of seafarers, because we went with a unified voice. Mm-hmm. So I think for me it's, if we look to the future, which I know not yet, but just to give a hint, we have to agree the terms of engagement. We have to communicate in a different way to our memberships. And we perhaps have to ideologically be optimistic about exactly what we want for the future seafarer.
Mm-hmm. All right, very interesting. Helio, can you give us, coming from ICS, a policy contributor, Steve referred to that already. Normally we have rather technical meetings in obscure rooms and the general public doesn't notice. All of a sudden, shipping became part of a United Nations General Assembly. And Steve and others talked to the Director General of the United Nations. How did that come and how did the staggering approach happen over a few weeks? How did that happen so quickly?
Yeah, thank you, Max. Just before I really dive deep, I just want to humanize a little bit the conversation, because I think Belal and Steve have really highlighted the impact of the pandemic. But I think one thing we need to keep in mind, those were 400,000 lives, right, at the height of the pandemic, that were essentially completely disrupted. And it's not just those that couldn't make it out of the ships, it was their family members under those heightened circumstances. So we really must not forget that. And that really builds to the spirit of cooperation that was strengthened through COVID. And I tend to think that in large part, personalities have a huge impact in how organizations are shaped and how they move forward. And credit to Belal and Francesco and Steve and Guy, with you at the helm and with our respective chairmen, we were able to really come together and put any differences aside and being able to find those synergies that we needed. And one perfect example of this was the joint action group that we brought together, along with the IMO and the ILO and the World Health Organization, ITF, ourselves representing the ship owners, but also IATA Aviation and so on, to really take stock and learn from the lessons that needed to be learned on behalf of all transport workers, not only seafarers. But Steve made a very good point, and that goes to actually what ultimately went wrong was that governments had found a very easy place to hide in the WHO international health regulations. So as part of this work that we did with this joint action group, one thing that we were pushing very hard for is to make sure that in the future we have a much better balance between the IHR requirements and those requirements of the MLC, which frankly were trampled on, to be quite frank. So we need to have these open discussions. I really appreciate what Francesco said yesterday. Let's focus on issues that are practical and that we can practically resolve. I think I'm summarizing what you said yesterday, and I very much welcome those discussions. And that takes me to sort of the SDG goals that IMEC has decided to focus on: decent work and economic growth, partnership for the goals, very much encapsulating the MOU that we have together. But an MOU, I hate the word partnership. It's just me personally, not because of what it says. When I hear partnership, I feel, there's varying degrees of partnership. Some you can really tell what the tangible outcome of the partnership will be. Others, they look good on a press release and they look good on a website, but actually what do they achieve at the end? And that is really what is important. And that's what I appreciate about IMEC, actually, if I can be so frank, because they're very practical and they're looking for solutions as we are, and ITF is as well. So.
Let me take the practical part back to Steve. And I think one of the outcomes of the various discussions throughout COVID was the term key worker. We'd never worked with the term key worker, really. And all of a sudden, key worker seemed to become an utterly important term. But a few weeks later, once we used it a lot, nobody knew exactly what it meant. How can we develop and use this term in the future and make it useful? Because now everybody's aware of it. What is it? And second part of the question to you, was it possibly a problem that the shipping industry and seafarers have been too efficient during COVID? We never caused a problem to the world because seafarers kept on working.
Yeah.
And people said, okay, that's fine. There is no problem. But maybe start with key worker. How can we develop that?
So I think we're probably already a little bit disappointed that the reality of COVID and seafarer heroes that provided all the supplies and kept everything moving, it's very easy, moves back to business as usual. But the reality, I think, certainly for us, ITF in this sense, is the significance of global supply chains is newsworthy. So if you want to have solid economic growth, and we can talk about the impacts on supply chains, Suez Canal blocked by a ship, and war in Ukraine, war in Sudan, we somehow went from invisible to public. And while the planes weren't flying, the ships were moving. So there were some really serious conversations amongst ourselves, probably quite radical, and I'm not sure if I'm allowed to talk about them, about should we just all walk out? Because I think there was an inherent anger in all of the players, but nobody actually cares about the 400 seafarers, plus the seafarers who can't come to sea, plus their families. And we couldn't get any sense out of policymakers. So the key worker question is to give us some authority, to give us some definable status. I mean, we would probably argue it's not just seafarers, it's other parts of the supply chain as well. So the question then is, how do you use a recognition, and I don't want to be too political, but many of the government officials we spoke to don't know anything about anything. They don't understand that if you don't deliver food or energy, your societies will collapse. So it was kind of insightful and frankly disappointing. But then on another level, it gives us this opportunity about, well, what if we have a vision? What if the seafarers, or the unions know what they think it should be like? Then we get into that conversation about how can we use that above and beyond this process.
Yeah.
So I think in the big question about what comes next, we have to be more transparent. When we spoke to a lot of financiers about human trafficking, and we tacitly understood that what the ICS could say governmentally is one kind of message, what IMEC could say is another kind of message, and what the ITF is allowed to say, everyone wants us to be even more outrageous and confrontational. And we tried that because in the end, we had 400 people that are our people, your people, whose people, they're people. So I think the big question is, when you see a strategic dynamic that can actually make the UN Secretary General post about seafarers, well, there is some power. Just the fact that we've been treated as a secret enemy. And to answer the question about, there is something about the shipping industry that is self-perpetuating. Whether it's the personalities, so like you're a seafarer and all of a sudden the Atlantic Ocean tries to kill you, you have that mentality that we'll get through this. The industry has a resilience which is to its credit, but when it comes to political bargaining, maybe to its disadvantage.
Yeah.
And we did talk about withdrawing everybody out. They would never admit that, but I wouldn't put them in that position. Yeah. But the reality was, actually, there was a feeling in the industry that we have a responsibility to keep going. Mm-hmm. So we need to find another way to kick the doors in, use a polite term, to get the policy change. And I think that's a conversation that takes us into where do we want to go with this? Yeah. And just because shipping is quite unique, and I say we don't have the same coalition in civil aviation. It's governed by national interests. All the other sectors we're very active in, road, it's governed nationally. How do we use that? Mm-hmm. What's our responsibility now?
Yeah. Belal, so we look into the future now. We've talked about COVID, lessons from COVID, cooperation under COVID. Then a few weeks ago, the three of you signed an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding for deepening dialogue, I think it said. Where does it head? Is it restricted to the three of you, or do you want to go beyond that? And what do you want to achieve with that MOU exactly?
Yeah, thanks, Max. I think, again, just a bit of a background to our MOU is it obviously came out of what we did together, as I mentioned before. Post-pandemic, even today, a year and a half after industry came out of pandemic, we still today, I tend to feel that is the world again going back to forgetting the seafarers? Yeah, nobody sees them working, so you have things in your home, on your table, everything is moving, people tend to forget the seafarers. And I think we can see that. What came after the pandemic is that it's not just the three leadership of the organizations, but our directors, the members of all three organizations worked so closely. We became friends, not just in bracket, but we became real friends to understand each other. And we all realized that this is unique. And then we had conversation among us that how do we not forget this and don't restart it when there is another crisis. We can just quickly assemble and basically do this thing that we did before. But that needed a kind of a understanding, not just verbally, but something more concrete. But that alone will not keep us together. We needed to do more. And that's why we said, everybody realizes the industry challenges that is coming. And one of the things that I shared personally among us and with Stephen is that all the changes that innovation is bringing cannot be tackled by the employers alone. Employers are under huge pressure by regulatory bodies, port state, governments, to make sure that the ships moves without any incident. But then we are putting technology on board, which the people who are providing is not giving a solution for the training, for making the seafarers. So I can give an example of even our own company, simple mid-size LPGs. It can use 5 different types of fuel. So 5 different types of fuel is not a matter of joke. Every time you change your fuel, you have to do something, but no training. So we had to, as an employer, we had to spend a lot of money to train these people. So I was talking to Stephen and say, how do we solve this puzzle? Because these things are not cheap. Shipping is a business. End of the day, we can be throwing $1 million for training and have an earning of less than that. So we were saying we need to work together to not only just pressure the governments and the regulators, but also those machinery makers who throws all this new technology to us, but then charges us to learn it. Come on. So that's probably not fair. Yeah. And then we know the shipping is kind of regional. Ship owners comes from one part, managers come from another part, and actual seafarers come from different part of the world. And none of these challenges on training is not available to those countries such as Philippines and India. We have to get our guys to North Europe to get trained, spend a lot of money. So that is like one of the challenges. Then we realized that the UN Just Transition Goals, now that is, nobody can work alone. That will really require all of us. And Stephen took us to New York, I remember, Global Maritime Forum, and we have learned a lot. And since then, we have been moving together to understand what is just transition and how we can all be part of it. And many of us, this messaging is not for us. Its messaging is for those young generation of seafarers to understand.
Yeah, we will come to that in a moment still, and get a bit deeper into that. Helio, very briefly, what are you expecting under the MOU from regulators? I mean, if the 3 of you are now together, obviously approaching different UN bodies, what needs to change on the side of the UN bodies?
If I can just build a little bit on what Belal said and give you one practical example of the effectiveness of our MOU. 50,000, that is the number of Filipino seafarers whose social and economic livelihoods were at stake with respect to their potential ability of no longer being able to work on board ships flagged in the EU. And as I said earlier, leadership really does make a difference. And in the Philippines, we now happen to have a president that really does understand the strategic importance of shipping to his country. So we had a ship owner and seafarer delegation, which I believe included Belal, both Belal and Steve and other ship owner representatives and seafarer representatives, which met with the president in Brussels and had practical discussions about what we as a collective saw as the solutions for that. And this is where the leadership came in. The government rolled up its sleeve and said, right, we're going to listen to industry. We're going to work with them to make sure that we are in the best position possible to ensure that we're safeguarding the livelihoods of those 50,000 Filipino seafarers. This took a lot of work. This took a lot of discussions back and forth. We established what we called it, it's a really long name, International Advisory Committee on Global Maritime Affairs. Those who have participated know it, and we look at it very fondly. But actually, jokes aside, it led to a practical, tangible outcome. But we're not stopping there. There's more that we need to see done. With respect to international organizations, I mentioned before, one of the things we want is better synergy. Because ultimately, international law doesn't really exist, because you need to ratify it at national level. So it always ends up on national level and what governments are willing to do. Obviously, under the guise of a collective effort as well. And I'm happy to touch on just transition.
Yeah, we'll come to that. Steve, there was a question from the audience. How does what you do here with the MOU compare to other areas of the ITF or the union world, or are you the outcast who's doing things completely differently?
No, I think we have to reflect, and again, there are elements of personality that doesn't change whether you're dealing with civil aviation or maritime. So I think what I learned from my role as maritime coordinator, Jackie now doing a marvellous job fulfilling the next phase, is how to build partnerships. And I'm okay with partnerships as long as there's tangible, measurable deliverables.
Yeah, that's the key.
And we've not always been fantastic at that. So we also have to hold ourselves to an account on a new level of what's practicable. So I think in the sense of other sectors, it's much more difficult to build alliances. So like if I said to you, just pick North America, I think last time I counted, we have 15 unions who may not all share the same point of view, sometimes, or many times. So coalescing around a conversation about supply chain or climate, it's very controversial.
Yeah.
So the difference, and I see what we've all been doing, and part of the celebration, this event, is building those layers. So the relationship with the ICS has never informally been bad. We have good days and we have bad days. Certainly over the ILO minimum wage, but we won't go there. The reality is...
Very good days.
You have to tell the truth, right? But the reality is the relationships have been there. But I think at a moment in time, having been through a crisis like the pandemic, we have a responsibility. And I will use what we do here to challenge civil aviation. There's a meeting right now in the ILO in Geneva. So the reality is the world is changing, and I think because I feel confident about the relationship, I think maybe we need the next part, we need to be a bit idealistic about what does the future of the seafarer look like, and not be compartmentalised about the reality we've lived. You said it beautifully, Max. We went from sailing to engines, national seafarers, international seafarers. Maybe now's the time to go, actually, what do we want from a seafarer?
Yeah.
How do we, do we want to digitalise the same system that doesn't work? Anyway, I'll stop. You know, I should share the panel.
Belal, very brief one for this part of the discussion. Are we prepared for COVID point 2?
I think we are, because this spirit of cooperation means when the next crisis comes, we will be able to assemble just like that.
Yeah.
And that is important. But one of the things, probably since you brought up COVID, I remember, and many of us, one of the things that we did obviously was the quarantine facility and the way it worked, and we set up this SG Star in Singapore and all those things. But then we came out of this, you may remember Neptune declarations. The companies were signing up, but when we wanted to do crew change, the same companies who signed up wouldn't allow. So then I remember in our company, I was to tell the operation manager, just please send the Neptune declaration to him again and see. Still they don't budge.
Yeah.
The thing is, those challenges probably will come back to us again, but in the transition between now and the next crisis, we need to work together to see if we can get IMO and ILO to agree on certain form that say in the event of another crisis coming, we must allow certain things, the free flow of the seafarers.
Yeah.
And if I may remember, some of us who are old enough to remember when you started our career at sea, the seafarer didn't even need a passport to travel. There was no such thing. I don't remember they called us a key worker, but we are allowed to travel like priority passengers to join ships. Today, with so much restrictions, my view is, yes, we are ready for next crisis, but between now and then, we probably need to come to some global international agreement that every country will respect, that in the event of these, seafarer plays such a key role, you can't impede their passage to home and back to the ship and both ways.
All right. Helio, you have been involved, and I think Steve had been at the origin of that, in the UN Global Compact. We have the Just Transition Task Force, which maybe sounds a bit like gibberish for many in the room. first of all, in very simple terms, what is that? And Belal mentioned earlier, 800,000 seafarers have to be retrained in the next couple of years. What does just transition meaning in that context? Very practically for the seafarers in the room here.
Thanks. And if I can just quickly reflect on 2 points that Steve and Belal made. The first one, Steve, about being idealistic, about the role of the seafarer of the future. And Francesco, if you'll forgive me about plugging, I know you said, but this is our event, so I think it gives us an opportunity to plug our event in Manila in June, where we will have discussions very much along these lines. With respect to your question to Belal, actually, are we prepared for Pandemic 2.0? Here I'm going to do a little ICS plug, if you don't mind. And I see my mentor, Natalie Shaw, sitting over there. And actually, she is working on guidelines to address a future pandemic in the event that one arises. So Natalie, I want to do justice to the great work that you're doing, and I very much look forward to seeing the finished product once it's out. Looking at just transition and what this all means. So we talked about partnerships, and I think we're all in agreement that partnerships are only really partnerships if you've got a tangible outcome at the end. The Just Transition Maritime Task Force was essentially agreed to look at decarbonization from the perspective of the seafaring workforce. A lot of the focus has been on the ships, as Max rightly pointed out. Can we get some of the limelight on those people who actually operate the ship? Because otherwise you are putting not only their lives at risk, the ships themselves, the environment, communities, and so on, just keeping in mind some of the fuels that are being considered for propulsion for shipping in the future. So that's essentially where we came, where the Just Transition and Maritime Task Force arose from. So 1 year on, between COP26 and COP27, last year we produced a report alongside Classification Society, DNV, and that was very much to contextualize the issue. And what we found was that hundreds of thousands of seafarers using different models prepared by DNV will require some level of training for decarbonization by 2050. And before that, even in the 2030s. You don't actually need a study or a big report or fanfare to know that. You really don't. The industry is decarbonizing. There will be huge changes, but it's important to put everything in a proper context and to have the industry discussions that we've had since the publication of these of this report. Now, informed by that report, we produced a 10-point action plan, really high level in terms of what we set out as our collective vision for what we would like to see in terms of a just transition for seafarers. Where do we want STCW, the STCW training framework to work? Do we need to look at recruitment and retention? And I'll come back to those in a minute. So these were discussions that we had, and we ended up with a product that we call the 10-point action plan. So between then and now, we've been promoting this and really getting it into the hearts and minds of people. One of the first people whose hearts and mind I wanted to win was the man sitting over there, Francesco Gargiulo, because I know that IMEC and ICS do completely different things. They come from the employer's perspective, we come primarily from the ship owner's perspective. There is a lot of room to create synergies in a project like this. So one of the biggest priorities I had this year, and I know Steve shared the same thoughts, was to bring them closer. And so that as part of our MOU, we're really taking a leadership position where we're making sure that whatever the outcomes of this partnership will be, that will be tangible. So I'll dive in a little bit, Max, into what this actually means in terms of the work that we're doing now. Well, I've mentioned phase 1. Phase 2, we're going to break what we call our global peer learning group, which is made up of shipping companies, seafarer organizations, and other stakeholders. And we're going to break into 2 action groups. One action group will be looking at recruitment and retention, and one action group will be looking at training for decarbonization. How do these become practical? Recruitment and retention is something that I've heard being discussed in the industry for years. And it's a nice discussion topic, but if we have the right people in the room and thinking really strategically about this, we can find solutions. And this is sort of the mindset that we have established within this task force. So we're bringing together people from Steve's side, people from our side, to really come up with practical solutions. The first bit will be a root cause analysis. We really need to understand what those underlying factors that are causing seafarers to not join the industry and so on. I know we'll all have our individual ideas, but I think we need something that we collectively coalesce around. And this is what a root cause analysis will do. Developing on from the root cause analysis, we then want to do a sort of take stock of what is best practice. So the root cause analysis will be based on things like working conditions on board. What are your thoughts? Giving a voice to seafarers, very much in line with what Francesco mentioned yesterday. So the second pillar will be looking at a blueprint for what being a good employer looks like in terms of working conditions, in terms of welfare and so on. What is being done out there? And can we learn lessons from other industries that we can adapt to our own reality? So that's the second pillar. The third pillar is one that's very close to my heart, and it's actually what gave me the idea in the first place, but then I had to work my way back a little bit. But essentially, when I started working with Natalie over a year ago or so, I wanted to do something on recruitment and retention. I really was very passionate about this. But there were already so many things being done out there. And I didn't want to just have something that it's just a siloed product, and we don't like silos. So the idea is, as a third pillar, we're going to find a way to bring all these different initiatives to talk to each other in a way that is cohesive. It's a massive undertaking, but we need to be ambitious in our approach and see where we land. But I think we've got the right people on board. And the one point that I would like to make for all those employers and shipowner representatives, I've actually got a briefing that is specific to shipowner representatives on Thursday, the 4th of May next week. If you are a shipowner or operator representative and you would like to be part of it and you want to learn more about the great work that we're doing, please get in touch with your business card and I'll make sure you get a link to it.
Okay, that was the advertising break. Steve, what do seafarers think about being told you have to be retrained now constantly? Do they like that idea?
So, not just seafarers, all workers are very nervous, probably all of you are very nervous of all these challenges coming, because change can be scary. Yeah. And part of this whole initiative is to demystify for our seafarers in the room, but also there's not going to be immediately 1.4 million LPG seafarers manufactured like that. So we have to manage the communications, we have to demystify what is a green job. And then I think the challenge out to the room is, are we employing, employment and retention is the ITF's life. Mm. And that's where I kind of want to challenge ourselves, and particularly where we've come from on the IMEC journey, which is a phenomenal journey. But I think I could describe it this way. If there's no public transport in Nairobi, guess what happens? Illegal taxis appear and someone fills the gap. Mm. And I'm kind of the view, maybe we've had our time of filling the gap. Maybe we should say collectively what we want. Yeah. I have always struggled with, and we probably know more ship owners and we have a very constructive relationship with them, understanding why you'll spend 100 million on a ship, and then you'll argue about how much money you pay someone, and you give them a 3-month contract. Yeah. If I took you to an oil major, which is very unpopular now, their personal development for their people, their risk analysis is way more sophisticated than our mentality. Mm-hmm. So for me, the question is very much about, if you want maritime professionals that are of the highest caliber by the 2050 date, one, we have to make sure all the existing seafarers are not terrified about the future and don't just look for alternative jobs. Yeah. And that's where all this work is about, building our collective confidence to speak with authority in this space. It may be hydrogen, it may be ammonia, but in the end, you will be part of the solution. And we say, the seafarer, the unions, will shape that solution because we are part of the infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So how do we do that, Max, is the real big challenge.
Belal, we're coming to the end of the panel, but share some of your radical rethinking about training. You had quite a few thoughts of how training has to change, where it has to go, who has to do it. How will training in the future have to look like to be effective and efficient to the seafarers who really want on board?
Yeah, thanks. Since the word, I not mistakenly, intentionally use the word radical, rethinking of what the seafarers of future should be, but sometimes I do feel, is it inappropriate for me to say, because we do represent our members who has set certain KPI, as Francesco would say, we can't go beyond, but this being a forum for talk about future, I think the biggest challenge in order to solve that is, how do we, in the beginning, get the people competing with the industries ashore to get the best in the industry? But if we want to get the best into our industry, we need to say, okay, guy, what do you actually want when you get to sea? What kind of employment terms and conditions you would like to see? And many of the things that we will offer them today will not be palatable to them in even today's world. So how do you do that? Now, this transition from 4-6 months contract to something more manageable, that people can have a social life at the same time, be on board, is something that cannot happen overnight. Shipping is an industry, it's a business, and we need to have that transition and need support from IMO, Helio, the governments, from everybody. So which means that for me, that is the biggest challenge. How do we attract? And training, obviously, we like to see, and I think 3 of our organizations, we will going to start working on pressuring. The training should be made available where it is needed, not where a component is made. How do we achieve that? And that is not going to happen by employers alone. I don't believe the ITF alone can do this. Even ICS alone can do this. Mm-hmm. So we need a combined effort to make sure that it must come from the top globally. That if you make something, it is essential on board, make sure the training is available where it is needed. It is very important. And this morning we saw Admiral Santos. I mean, they provide a lot of things, but they can't provide certain things which is needed for the ships that is coming out today, because that's simply not available to them to provide that training in the Philippines. So that's probably is big challenge, but which I think we have discussed many times. If we can achieve that, a regulatory compliance of machinery makers from Germany, Denmark, or wherever they come from, basically, that they will agree that if you roll out something to a ship that is new and not been there before, they will have an obligation to ensure that the large major labor supply countries have that training facility made available at the same time, and not just a token training for the first batch of crew in the shipyard and then forget about the rest of the crew that is coming later. So that would be something that I would like to see.
Great, thank you. I think that was a very good last word. Thank you very much to the panel for giving us a political insight on where we stand and where we are going to go in the next couple of years. Thank you very much.